Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Everake Insights, and we're back with a bit of a weekly update. This week, we've got a bit of an update on the Pulse auction, second one in a row, some New Zealand trade analysis, a little bit of a chat on inflation, and of course, the very famous chart of the week.
The fabled chart of the week. I just want to put some background into this discussion about where the market's at. This is out of our Global Directions platform. It sits in our DTS, kind of adds up the global market in a way and expresses it in a net demand position. So the bars above the line mean the market is firming or tightening. Below the line, where we've been for a while, we've got oversupply. And the value line is a skim butter return on Oceania values. So that's showing where we're heading upwards. Our values are, these are the fundamental values are tracking firmer. So that's a general tone. Our outlook's going to be out tomorrow to our subscribers.
Yep.
But that's good background to look at what's going on with some key Oceania prices. And this is a Pulse result, but it lines up where the GDT has been the last few events. And, we're seeing that general rising fat protein value supporting whole milk powder in this respect. Obviously, more demand coming to the platform, being carefully managed by the major exporter in this.
But it's a fairly good trajectory, or similar trajectory to what we're seeing in the fundamentals.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it shows up well in the Oceania market where you see that through. Skim milk powder, less convincing. A lot more going on here. A lot of influence.
You squint. There's a little bit of a trend starting there.
You're right.
Yes.
You can. If you sit back in a poor light, you can see that. But it's encouraging that it's continuing that upward momentum. This is interesting though, where this shows the relative values across futures prices in each of the major producers.
Because each of those GDT events in the last couple of weeks on Pulse still falling short of where the local futures market think things should be, isn't it?
Well and truly. So there's still, and you can see how flat, Europe is relatively flat. There's a lot more influence going on there, and that's something for a different discussion, I guess, what's impacting that. But still a strong belief that the NZX prices will continue in skim milk powder to reflect stronger demand coming to the platform in future events. Very bullish.
Yeah.
Will it turn out that way?
Yeah.
Anyway, leaving that.
Bit of a segue into New Zealand exports here, Steve, and the December data came out this week, so we can have a look at how the years and the second half of 2023 really lined up, and there's some interesting data there in terms of what's happened with product mix changes and therefore much more skim milk powder going out the door from New Zealand, Steve.
There is. That's obviously important. They've shifted a lot of milk towards skim milk powder in the last season. You can see that first half of calendar year where a lot got, particularly to China, got shipped as they opened up and things look better. But you can also see the vulnerability of fat. Those two little green bars pointing downwards, like fat trade has not responded to the same extent as you've seen protein.
Yeah, and that reflects, I guess, that year data was very much affected by the early part of the year when there were some opportunities for New Zealand butter exports or fat exports into the US and the EU, Steve. And in the second half, that opportunities well and truly dried up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the little bars on the right-hand side, MSE, milk solids equivalent, which this overall metric of milk solids in the trade, breaking that down, that small increase we've seen in the last 6 months, breaking it, you can see China is where that's fallen away. These are just the solids in the chart, so those numbers are quite big in terms of product volumes.
Sure.
How Southeast Asia, which might surprise, but their trade into Southeast Asia out of New Zealand, which has picked up share, has been quite good, particularly the second half. I mean, they've outshone and lifted the full year number because of what's happened in the second half. Same with the Middle East. It's a lot of second half trade there that's lifted that. And that's butterfat as well as protein gone into that market, and lately whole milk powder. So those two regions are certainly responding to low prices in a lot of that trade. So that's what's kicked those numbers up. as we see values rise, will they stay there? Will we see as much trade? We think that's probably there's a risk that weakens as we still see a lot of headwind in consumption in those markets. We'll
Sure.
come on to that.
We will. And Oceania is an interesting one, just reflecting that there's much more milk in this part of the world than we were probably expecting. So it's dried up a little bit in Oceania in the second half of the year as well, Steve.
Which really reads Australia. When you look at the New Zealand
Sure.
trade, it's mostly coming into this country.
Mhm.
Yeah, more milk, less room for cheese and butterfat.
That's right.
So inflation.
Yeah, we've been having a bit of a chat about this week. This is a kind of exciting life we lead here, Steve. But talking about, there's a lot of discussion about how governments are doing a bit of a victory lap. We've got inflation under control, it's coming down, and some expectations out there that this therefore means that demand for dairy should improve. So you pulled out this data, Steve, and it's stark, isn't it, just how much those prices have moved up.
Yeah, you know what? I thought it was useful looking a bit longer as to what's happened to the cost of food, where dairy sits in that. And so it's an index, a CPI. The CPI is the running index that's set, I think in this case 2015 is 100. So European consumers had little change in their cost of food for many years until we had the war commence, and that's really pushed everything up quite dramatically because of the pressures on supply. But prices are settling, and so those prices are now evening out, and we've seen some stability. Commodity prices are at a level where they're probably not going to fall a long way from here. The cost of milk and all that is stabilising at an elevated level. So the consumer's being asked to pay 30% more for food across the board.
Yeah.
Compared to what they did just 2 years ago. So it's quite an adjustment.
And it's a dramatic rise in a relatively short time. So I guess the question is, that we can't see necessarily across Europe, but what's happening with wages, and so the ability of people to pay these higher prices. But we've got some UK data, Steve.
Yeah, UK is, I think, really interesting. A similar looking chart in terms of food costs, and dairy is at the forefront there and still higher and still rising, strangely, in the latest data when we've seen such a drop-off in wholesale prices. So overlaying that the weekly pay, and I think the UK is probably one of the exceptions in Europe, but I will pull that out, Joe. I will find that data.
Yeah, we've got to find that.
So that's, elevated food costs in the UK, but the UK, when you look more widely, so think of that blue and green line there. When you
they look huge, don't they?
Yeah, put them in the context when you go to electricity and transport, where they're being comprehensively shafted. So that pales the cost of living adjustment when people are just dealing with energy and moving around. And I could put a whole lot of lines on here, other essentials that impact their cost. It's no wonder that economy is struggling and that people are spending a lot less on
everything.
On everything.
Yeah. We haven't put interest rates in there, obviously, and the adjustment that people have been undergoing there. So it's not a happy picture, is it, Steve? But I guess, in these markets, people still consume dairy. It's a staple. What about some of these Southeast Asian markets, Steve, where there's a lot less dairy consumed and there's a lot higher price sensitivity?
So the two biggest powder markets, skimmer powder markets in particular, Indonesia and Philippines, and largest population in the region. Again, same thing. This is an index over time. 2018 is 100, and their food prices are still rising. So you get the influence here of rice increasing a lot. Dairy in their mix is still probably rising in the end unit prices at retail. Prepared food is still moving up. You got sugar, you got cocoa, you got a lot of things going into those foods, which is still pushing up. Now that in these regions, Indonesia published this great data out of these countries. I was astonished at how much detail you can get on living costs and elements that drive inflation, etc., broken right down into their regions. So you can see cities and rural, and they're quite diverse. But here in Indonesia, they spend more than half their money on food. And so when that's taken, has been jacked by 20% over that couple of years, it's a fundamental adjustment to their cost of living. Now, in amongst that, dairy is a smidge. It's a very small component when you've got staples like rice and noodles and and various things like that, and meat. That dairy is a little bit of their food intake and generally a higher priced item.
And a discretionary one, therefore. Yeah. So, and you can see there that those food CPI numbers are not levelling off. They're still got quite a healthy,
they're still ramping
upward incline there. So, it's not a snapback situation in terms of demand that we're looking at.
So this was the thing you were talking about before, that CPI's coming off, inflation's falling, we've got good GDP, should be good, demand should come back. No.
Yeah.
There's a more complicated story here as they adjust to a higher cost of food in their total spend, and what are going to be the casualties.
That's right. Yeah.
So
it's sobering.
Mm-hmm. Therefore, we move to chart of the week and hopefully wrapping this up on a bright note.
Yes. Well, some data out of Europe. So we've got some production data, and that's sort of, I guess, met expectations. It's over 2% down in November. We're looking at there. We've seen some weekly data, Steve, that's a bit less negative than that. So
since that,
for the early part of 2024. But what's been interesting is some of the production data for manufactured products, if you move it on, to have a look at how much skim milk powder has come down. So we can see on the left-hand side the reduction in raw milk, but skim has really dropped substantially. Butter not so much. So we were talking about...
We're scratching our heads about this.
Yeah, how that really adds up. We know at the end of last year, and again, this is November, at the end of last year, the cream market was pretty tight. Speculating that maybe a bit more skim milk concentrate is doing the rounds and less going into the dryer, but some interesting numbers there, Steve.
Yeah, and fat-filled has been absorbing a bit more. We see the trade in fat-filled powders increasing in the second half of the year. That may be part of the reason. But also, and the other thing that doesn't help us, the fluid milk intake. So you get a bit of fat out of that goes into butter, but that's not making a huge change either there. So
yeah, interesting. And the cheese numbers, obviously there's a lot of volume in those cheese numbers and in those changes, but a bit down in the last few months. So
that's right. So I just wanted to step back briefly to the previous chart, talk about the fact that those big drops year on year that we've seen in the current year are against those comparables when we saw some pretty stunning increases.
True.
It's a combination of that year-on-year effect, but there's also some disease crept in to some regions. So blue tongue disease was cutting into Dutch production. We saw really wet weather in Ireland, which has dragged their numbers down appreciably, and that impacts the volume of skim, because while we might see a general change in the milk volume, which doesn't appear very much on that product chart, when some of your bigger producers have some difficulties with production, that might really cut into the output. So the mix is more complicated. Okay, well, look, that's a broad-ranging coverage of issues. We hope you've enjoyed this. We'll be back again next week with certainty. Thanks for viewing, and good to see you.